They were auctioning a mail-order bride holding her baby, until a Lakota warrior raised his hand first. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun, a relentless hammer, beat down on the dusty square, blurring the edges of the makeshift stage where she stood. Ilara, a name whispered in the dying embers of memory, clutched her infant son closer, his tiny form a warm, fragile anchor in a world that had become nothing but a cold, relentless current. The rough planks beneath her bare feet splintered, mirroring the cracks in her own spirit. Around her, a sea of faces, hardened by the unforgiving land and a stranger's peculiar cruelty, stared with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and a stark, chilling avarice. Each gaze was a needle pricking at her exposed skin, stripping away the last tattered remnants of her dignity. The air hung thick with the stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the simmering tension of a spectacle about to unfold. This was not the life she had been promised. It was a cruel perversion of a desperate gamble, a mockery of every hope she had dared to cling to in her flight across the endless ocean. Her breath hitched, shallow and ragged in her throat, a fragile butterfly trapped in a jar. Her eyes, wide and luminous with unshed tears, scanned the crowd, searching for a single flicker of compassion, but finding only the dull gleam of calculation. The auctioneer, a man whose face was a roadmap of cynicism and indulgence, cleared his throat, his booming voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blunted axe. He began his rehearsed litany, each word a fresh bruise upon her soul, detailing her meager assets, her supposed failings, her raw, undeniable vulnerability. He spoke of her as property, an object of utility, a commodity to be weighed and measured, her humanity stripped away piece by painful piece. Her baby whimpered, a soft, pathetic sound that tore at her heart, drawing a fresh wave of shame. She tightened her embrace, pressing her lips against his soft hair, a silent prayer for deliverance echoing in the desolate chamber of her mind. The bids began then, a low, guttural rumble from the front rows, each number a step further into the abyss, a tightening of the invisible chains around her wrists. The world tilted, a suffocating blur of sun and dust and leering eyes. She was a ghost, a shadow, watching her own undoing. The metallic clang of a gavel cracked through the simmering air, a sound too sharp for the heavy silence it broke. Just as the auctioneer's gaze lingered on a particularly eager bidder, a sudden stir rippled through the assembled crowd. It wasn't a shout or a commotion. It was a quiet, profound displacement, like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned, whispers spread, their hushed tones carrying a mixture of surprise, unease, and outright hostility. A man stood at the edge of the square, a figure carved from the very land itself. He was tall, his frame lean and powerful, cloaked in buckskin that seemed to absorb the relentless sun rather than reflect it. His hair, long and dark, was braided with an almost ceremonial care, falling over broad shoulders. His face, etched with a quiet intensity, held eyes that were deep pools of shadow and ancient wisdom, betraying nothing of the churning emotions that surely churned beneath their surface. He was Lakota, a warrior, his presence an immediate affront to the established order of this frontier town. The murmurs intensified, transforming into low growls of resentment and suspicion. Ilara, her gaze drawn by the collective shift, saw him. Her fear, already a suffocating blanket, intensified, giving way to a fresh, sharp edge of bewilderment. He was a specter from the stories, a warning whispered in hushed tones around campfires, a figure of the wild, untamed land. His presence here, at this auction, was an anomaly, a stark, unsettling paradox. The auctioneer, momentarily flustered, cleared his throat again, a nervous tremor in his voice. He seemed to shrink under the warrior's unwavering gaze, his usual bluster deflating. The air thickened, charged with an unspoken challenge. The warrior, impassive, his expression unreadable, simply raised his hand. His gesture was slow, deliberate, devoid of any theatricality. It was not a grand flourish, but a quiet, irrefutable act of defiance. The single word that followed, low and resonant, cut through the tension with the precision of a hunting knife. 50. Not dollars, but an unspecified measure, a silent, audacious challenge to the very premise of the auction. The crowd gasped, a collective expulsion of breath. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What did this mean? Was this a rescue, a further descent, or something else entirely? Something utterly beyond her understanding. The word hung in the air, a stone thrown into a quiet pond, sending ripples of disbelief and fury outwards. 50. It was not a currency recognized by this crude marketplace, nor was it delivered with the expected cadence of a bidder. It was a statement, a claim, a defiance. The auctioneer, regaining a sliver of his bluster, scoffed, a thin, reedy sound of contempt. 50 what, savage? We deal in honest coin here, not trinkets. His voice, though aimed at the warrior, was laced with a desperate plea for the familiar order to return. But the Lakota warrior remained impassive, his eyes fixed not on the auctioneer, but on Ilara and the child she cradled. His gaze held no judgment, no lust, only a profound, unsettling stillness. It was as if he saw something in her that no one else in that square could, a reflection of a shared, unspoken burden. A low growl erupted from the crowd, a collective beast roused from its slumber. Get out of here! No redskin buys white women? The insults flew like poisoned arrows, sharp and venomous, exposing the raw prejudice that festered beneath the town's rough exterior. Men shifted, their hands unconsciously reaching for the axes tucked into their belts, or the rifles slung over their shoulders. This was more than an auction now. It was a flashpoint. Ilara, transfixed, watched the warrior. Her fear had not abated, but it had morphed, shifting from the primal terror of the auction block to a bewildered apprehension of this new, unpredictable force. Was this a different kind of captivity? A transfer from one cage to another? Or was there some strange, unsettling promise in his gaze? The auctioneer, sensing the escalating tension, tried to regain control, his voice cracking slightly. Gentlemen, let's proceed properly." He nodded towards a burly man in the front row, already offering a higher, more acceptable bid. But the warrior, undeterred, simply raised his hand again, his voice echoing with an unnerving calm. 50 then, or more. She is worth more than your gold." Each word was a gauntlet thrown, a direct challenge to their ingrained assumptions, their sense of ownership over everything they surveyed. The bids escalated, not out of desire for her, but out of a desperate need to reclaim a perceived insult, to assert dominance over this unwelcome intruder. But for every raise, the warrior met it, his gaze unwavering, his resolve an unyielding fortress. The price soared, far beyond what any mail-order bride would typically fetch, driven by the raw, irrational fury of men scorned. The final thunderous strike of the gavel echoed through the suddenly hushed square, a pronouncement that felt both impossible and inevitable. The Lakota warrior had won. The price he had paid, a sum far beyond any reasonable market value, had been driven by the furious, desperate attempts of the townsmen to outbid him, to reassert their perceived superiority. Yet, he had persevered, his calm resolve a stark contrast to their sputtering rage. A collective gasp, then a wave of angry shouts broke the stunned silence. "This is an outrage! He can't take her!" Men surged forward, their faces contorted with fury, their hands gripping the tools of their trade like weapons. Ilara, clutching her baby tighter, felt a profound tremor run through her. Relief, stark and unexpected, warred with a terrifying new dread. She was no longer chattel for these men, but she was now tied to him, to this silent, enigmatic warrior. What fate awaited her now? In his hands, in his world. The warrior, unhurried, stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He did not brandish a weapon, nor did he offer a challenge. His silent presence was enough, an unyielding barrier against the rising tide of hostility. The auctioneer, pale and sweating, stammered, The sale is final. By custom, he paid." His words were a reluctant admission, forced by the unwritten laws of their crude commerce, even as every fiber of his being rebelled against it. The rage of the crowd, denied its full expression, simmered into a menacing hum. As the warrior reached the base of the platform, his gaze met Ilara's. For a fleeting moment she saw not an enemy or a savior, but a man burdened by his own unspoken story. He offered no hand, no word, only a subtle gesture, a tilt of his head towards the edge of the square. It was an invitation, or perhaps a silent command to descend. Her legs, heavy with the weight of terror and exhaustion, threatened to give out. She stumbled but did not fall, her focus fixed on the baby, a tiny shield against the world's harshness. The walk away from the platform was an eternity. Every step was a gauntlet, every face a mask of hatred. Whispers followed them like a venomous cloud, calling her a traitor, a savage's prize. Her baby whimpered again, sensing the palpable tension, and she instinctively pulled him closer, pressing him against her chest, a desperate, silent promise that she would protect him, even from this unknown fate. The dust of the town clung to them, a fine, gritty shroud, as they moved away from the lingering hostility of the square. The warrior set a steady, relentless pace, his long strides carrying him further and further into the open plains, leaving the crude confines of the settlement behind. Ilara, stumbling to keep up, her arms aching from the weight of her child, found herself trapped in a suffocating silence. It was a silence thicker than any spoken word, heavy with unspoken questions and profound apprehension. She dared not speak, dared not ask. What would she even say? Where were they going? Why had he done this? Her mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of scenarios, none of them comforting. Every rustle of the prairie grass seemed to hold a hidden threat, every shadow a lurking danger. Her gaze darted to the warrior's back, then to his profile, searching for any telltale sign, any hint of his true intentions. But his face remained a stoic mask, revealing nothing. She was a captive, yes, but of what kind? Her past, a mosaic of hardship, flashed before her eyes. The blight that had withered their small farm, the debts that had suffocated her family, the false promise of a new life in this distant land. It had been a desperate gamble, a last futile attempt to escape the grip of poverty and hunger. The advertisements had painted a picture of opportunity, of kind-hearted men seeking wives, of fertile land awaiting cultivation. But the reality had been a brutal awakening, a broken agreement, a forced sale, and now this. An auction where she was the prize. She had lost everything, even her name, which now felt too precious to utter in this barren wilderness. The warrior, sensing her struggle, slowed his pace slightly, turning to offer a silent canteen. The water was cool against her parched lips, a small act of unexpected kindness in a world that had offered only cruelty. But it did little to quell the gnawing fear that gripped her. His eyes, when they met hers, held no malice, but an unnerving emptiness, a profound melancholy that resonated with her own despair. It was as if he carried a burden as heavy as her own, a silent pact forged in the fires of shared suffering. Yet the fear remained, a cold, unwavering presence, a sentinel guarding her heart. The vast expanse of the prairie unfurled before them, an ocean of swaying grass under an endless sky. The silence that had accompanied their journey began to shift, losing some of its suffocating weight, though remaining profound. The warrior, whose name she still did not know, had led them far from the white settlements, his path unerring, purposeful. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, he guided them to a secluded hollow, nestled beside a small, murmuring stream. It was a place of quiet beauty, starkly contrasting with the brutal ugliness of the town they had left behind. There was no grand encampment, no bustling village, only a small, solitary teepee, its hide softened by the elements, blending seamlessly into the landscape. This was his home, or at least a temporary sanctuary. Ilara watched, wary but mesmerized, as he moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering dry wood, sparking a small fire. Its warmth, a fragile beacon against the encroaching chill of dusk, offered the first genuine comfort she had felt in days. Her baby, restless during the long journey, whimpered, and she instinctively rocked him, a silent plea for solace. The warrior, without a word, produced a strip of dried meat, tearing off a piece and offering it to her. Her hunger, long suppressed, roared to life, but she hesitated, her ingrained fear warring with a desperate need for sustenance. She remembered the stories, the fearsome tales of the Lakota, of their fierce independence and their perceived savagery. Yet, his actions contradicted the whispers of prejudice, offering a subtle, unsettling kindness. Flashback. her younger sister, pale and skeletal, lying in a bed of straw, her small hand clammy in Alara's, the gnawing hunger that had driven her to seek a solution, any solution. The advertisements, beautifully drawn, promising a new beginning in a land of plenty. A strong hand to help, they'd read. A new family awaiting. The bitter irony of it all now that she was being auctioned. A chattel. The warrior's eyes, as he watched her, held a similar sorrow. A profound understanding that transcended language. He wasn't a monster, she realized, but a man deeply scarred by his own unseen battles. He spoke then, his voice a low rumble, the words guttural and unfamiliar, yet laced with a cadence that spoke of ancient wisdom. My name is Kaya, listener of the wind. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the vast plain. You are safe here. The words, simple and direct, were a balm to her battered soul. A small but significant crack in the impenetrable wall of her fear. A glimmer of humanity, fragile yet undeniable, began to shine through the darkness. The small teepee, though rudimentary, offered a surprising sense of refuge, a womb of warmth against the vast, indifferent prairie night. Inside, the firelight danced, painting shifting patterns on the hide walls, illuminating the quiet dignity of Kaya's few possessions. He moved with a reverence for his surroundings, each action imbued with a silent purpose. He showed Ilara how to prepare a simple meal from dried berries and the meat he had offered earlier, his movements gentle, instructive. Her own hands, clumsy with fear and unfamiliarity, fumbled, but he did not chide or show impatience. His stoicism was not indifference, she slowly realized, but a deeply ingrained patience, a profound quietude. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of the prairie, a sensory anchor in her bewildering new reality. She watched him, still wary, still searching for the catch, the moment when the mask would slip, but it never did. His generosity was quiet, his vigilance constant. Her baby, surprisingly calm in the unfamiliar surroundings, slept fitfully in a makeshift cradle Kaya fashioned from softened hides. Flashback. The first meeting with the gentleman who had arranged her passage. His oily smile, the clammy handshake, the way his eyes lingered on her with an unsettling possessiveness. The swift descent from hopeful expectation to crushing disillusionment. The forced labor, the harsh words, the unspoken threats when she spoke of her child. The realization that she was not a bride, but indentured servitude, a living commodity. The memory sent a shiver through her, a fresh wave of indignity. But here, with Kaya, there was no such pretense. There was only the stark, undeniable truth of their shared humanity, however tenuous. One evening, as the stars glittered like scattered diamonds in the inky sky, Kaya spoke, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of untold stories. He spoke of the land, of his people, of the broken treaties and the encroachment of the white man's world. He spoke of the buffalo, once countless, now dwindling, and of the sorrow that permeated the very earth. He did not explicitly speak of his own losses, but the ache in his voice was a language she understood. She saw then, a painful clarity washing over her, that his act at the auction block was not one of conquest, but of profound empathy, born from a deep well of suffering that mirrored her own. He had seen her, not as a possession, but as a life, a mother trapped by the relentless tide of a world that sought to own and consume everything in its path. The days blurred into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the silent language of the prairie. Ilara, slowly, tentatively, began to shed the layers of fear and suspicion that had become her second skin. She learned to identify the calls of distant birds, to read the subtle shifts in the wind, to understand the quiet wisdom of Kaya's ways. She began to speak, faltering at first, then with increasing ease recounting her past, the desperate circumstances that had led her to become a mail-order bride, the lies that had lured her across the ocean. She spoke of her dying family, the barren fields, the hunger that had driven her to sign away her life for a false promise of a better future. Each word was a painful exhumation, but with Kaya, there was no judgment, only a profound listening silence. He sat across from her, his gaze steady, his presence a silent anchor against the tempest of her memories. He in turn shared glimpses of his own world, not through direct speech, but through the patient teaching of his ways. He showed her how to find water in the parched earth, how to track game, how to weave baskets from willow branches. He shared the Lakota tales of creation and of the spirits, and through them, she began to understand the depth of his connection to this land, a bond that transcended mere ownership. She saw the irony, stark and bitter, in how a savage treated her with more respect and dignity than the civilized men who had sought to buy and sell her. Her baby, growing stronger under Kaya's quiet care, became a symbol of this fragile, unexpected hope. He would sometimes coo at Kaya, his small hands reaching for the warrior's braided hair, an innocent connection that melted the ice around Ilara's heart. One afternoon, as they sat by the stream, Kaya spoke of a young woman from his village, taken by soldiers during a skirmish, never seen again. His voice, for the first time, held a tremor of raw grief. It was then she understood. His act at the auction was not merely an impulse of kindness, but a desperate attempt to reclaim a sliver of what had been lost, to defy the relentless tides of injustice that had swept through both their lives. Their separate wounds, once vast and isolated, began to find a shared resonance, a common language of suffering and unexpected solace. The lies that had defined her existence began to unravel, exposing a truth far more complex and humane than she could have ever imagined. The brittle peace of their existence shattered with the distant rumble of hooves. It was a sound Ilara had come to dread, a stark reminder of the world they had escaped, a world that now seemed intent on reclaiming its perceived property. Kaya's posture stiffened instantly, his senses honed to the subtle vibrations of the earth. He moved with a swift, silent grace, urging Ilara and the baby into the deeper cover of a dry creek bed, his hand a silent press on her back, a gesture of both urgency and protection. The sun, a brutal orb in the midday sky, beat down on them as they huddled, hidden beneath the sparse brush. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the muffled shouts of men and the creak of wagon wheels. This was not a patrol. It was a search party, relentless in its pursuit. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of pure terror. The memories of the auction block, of the leering faces and the crude pronouncements, flooded back with an overwhelming force. She was a runaway slave in their eyes, and Kaya, her silent protector, was nothing more than a savage abductor. A single, desperate question formed in her mind. Would Kaya fight? Would he abandon her? Her baby, sensing the profound shift in her demeanor, began to whimper, a small, vulnerable sound that felt amplified in the suffocating silence. A horse whinnied nearby, its breath hot and close. Voices, coarse and cruel, cut through the air. "They went this way, the Redskins got her." One voice, in particular, was chillingly familiar. The auctioneer, his bluster now laced with a vindictive certainty. He was determined to reclaim his lost profit, to enforce the brutal laws of his twisted world. Kaya, his face a mask of resolute calm, drew a worn leather pouch from his belt. He did not draw a weapon, but instead sprinkled a fine, powdery substance around their hidden spot, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. "They will not see us," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural murmur that resonated with an ancient power. It was a plea, a belief, an act of faith in the unseen forces of the land. Ilara watched, bewildered, then understood. He was not preparing for a violent confrontation, but for an evasion, a silent vanishing. A soldier's boot crunched nearby, startlingly close. Ilara instinctively pressed her baby's face into her shoulder, her own breath held. This was the moment of truth. Would the magic, the unseen protection hold, or would they be dragged back into the jaws of a world that sought only to consume them? The air thickened, charged with the palpable tension between desperation and an unwavering, almost supernatural resolve. She had to choose, succumb to the suffocating fear, or place her trust entirely in this quiet warrior and his unspoken promises. The crunch of a boot, unnervingly close, then the sudden rhythmic creak of wagon wheels moving past their hiding place, brought a raw, sputtering exhalation of breath from Ilara. The voices, though still audible, began to recede, their frustration clear in the increasingly angry shouts. Kaya's silent magic, his quiet faith in the land's unseen protection, had held. The crisis had passed, at least for the moment. The tension, stretched taut for what felt like an eternity, slowly began to dissipate, leaving Alara's body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. She looked at Kaya, truly looked at him, and for the first time saw him not as a strange, enigmatic savior, but as a man who had chosen to stand with her against an indifferent, cruel world. His eyes, usually pools of quiet wisdom, held a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, a weary tenderness, a shared understanding. There was no triumph in his gaze, only the quiet satisfaction of a battle won without bloodshed. "They will not return tonight," he murmured, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "The spirits watch over us." His words, once alien, now resonated with a deep, comforting truth. The shared ordeal had forged a new bond between them, something beyond the simple dynamic of rescuer and rescued. It was a connection born of mutual vulnerability and an unspoken recognition of kindred spirits. Alara found her voice, raspy but clear. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate yet laden with every ounce of gratitude she possessed. He simply nodded, his gaze sweeping over the vast, darkening prairie, as if communing with the very land that had sheltered them. The fire they built later that night, a small, defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness, seemed to burn brighter, warmer. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a comforting contrast to the dust and fear of the day. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the crickets chirping and the distant howl of a coyote. It was a silence that no longer felt oppressive, but rather a space for healing, for quiet reflection. She looked at her baby, peaceful in her arms, his small face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He was a promise, a future, and now, thanks to Kaya, he had a chance. The initial battle was over, but the war, she knew, was far from won. Yet for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the despair that had clung to her like a shroud began to lift, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping gesture, just the quiet understanding of two souls, once adrift, now anchored, however precariously, to each other. The air, cooled by the night, carried the scent of wet earth and pine, a stark contrast to the oppressive dust of the town. The encounter with the search party, though evaded, had left an indelible mark, stripping away any lingering illusions. They were truly alone now, two disparate souls united by the very world that sought to divide them. The unspoken pact between Alara and Kaya deepened, transforming from a reluctant alliance into something more profound, a shared journey on the periphery of a collapsing world. Alara found herself speaking more freely, not just of her past, but of her deepest fears and fleeting hopes. She spoke of the loneliness that had driven her across the ocean, of the profound disillusionment that had greeted her, and the terror of losing her child to a callous system. Kaya listened, his silence not a void, but a presence that affirmed her words, a deep well of understanding. He, in turn, began to share, not through detailed narratives, but through quiet observations, through ancient stories that wove themselves into the fabric of the land. He spoke of his people's sacred connection to the earth, of the traditions that sustained them, and the profound sorrow of watching their way of life erode under the relentless advance of the white man. He spoke of the broken promises, the stolen lands, the forced migrations, and the quiet dignity with which his people faced their encroaching demise. It was a narrative of parallel suffering, two separate rivers of grief now converging into a single flowing current. The baby, no longer just a burden or a symbol of her loss, became a beacon of their fragile future. He cooed, gurgled, and occasionally reached out to touch Kaya's braids, an innocent bridge between two worlds. Kaya would respond with a gentle smile, a rare softening of his stoic features, holding the child with a surprising tenderness. These were the moments that solidified Alara's trust, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, consistent acts of profound humanity. She realized the true irony. She had sought a husband, a protector, in a world that saw her as property, only to find true refuge with a man deemed a savage by that very world. The old prejudices, once so deeply ingrained, now seemed like a cruel joke, a veil that had obscured genuine kindness. The scars of their past, though visible, began to lose their raw edge, transforming into a shared understanding, a silent language spoken between two people who had found solace in an unlikely connection. The vastness of the prairie, once a symbol of her isolation, now seemed to offer boundless possibility, a horizon promising not just survival, but the quiet, dignified beginning of a new, unforeseen existence. The threat of discovery, though temporarily abated, lingered like a distant storm cloud. It was a constant reminder of the fragile nature of their new existence, a world poised precariously between the past's brutal grip and a future yet undefined. Yet in the shadow of this uncertainty, something profound began to unfurl between Ilara and Kaya. Their dialogue, once sparse and guarded, blossomed into a quiet tapestry of shared vulnerability and emergent understanding. He spoke of the sacred hoop of life, of interconnectedness, concepts that resonated deeply with Ilara's own buried longing for belonging. She spoke of her simple dreams, a home, safety for her child, the dignity of honest labor, dreams that had been crushed under the heel of a society that valued profit over people. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping promises, but a deepening recognition of mutual respect. They were two broken halves finding an unexpected completeness in each other's presence. The baby, thriving under the prairie sun, giggled now, a sound that, for Ilara, held the weight of 1,000 prayers answered. Kaya would often watch him with a quiet intensity, his gaze filled with a protective solemnity that spoke of his own losses, his own yearning for new life. The immediate crisis had brought them together, but it was the quiet, day-to-day existence, the shared tasks, the silent understanding that was forging a bond stronger than any societal convention. Ilara, once a woman defined by her despair, began to find a nascent strength, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to hunt, to track, to read the signs of the earth, skills imparted by Kaya with patient instruction. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, adapting, learning, evolving. And Kaya, often perceived as an impassive warrior, allowed glimpses of the profound empathy that lay beneath his stoicism. He would share insights into the spirits of the land, the wisdom of his ancestors, weaving a rich tapestry of culture that Ilara, for the first time, truly understood. Their journey was not an escape to an endpoint, but a continuous unfolding, a discovery of shared ground in a world that sought to alienate and isolate. The scars remained, etched into their very beings, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were the marks of trials endured, of a past survived, guiding them towards a shared horizon, uncertain yet infused with the quiet, defiant hope of new beginnings. The horizon stretched before them, a vast, unbroken line where the earth met the sky, shimmering with the promise of a new day. It was not a destination, but a direction, a path forged by resilience and an unlikely connection. The initial fear, the crushing despair, had receded, replaced by a quiet strength that resonated within Ilara. She looked at Kaya, his profile etched against the dawn, and saw not a strange warrior, but a man who had offered refuge when the world had offered only cruelty. Their journey had not been about escaping to a specific place, but about finding a sanctuary within themselves, a shared space of trust and understanding. The baby, nestled securely in a soft deerskin carrier on Ilara's back, stirred, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He was the living embodiment of their future, a tender sapling pushing through barren earth. The world they faced was still fraught with dangers. The whispers of prejudice still carried on the wind, but they were no longer alone in confronting them. The bonds forged in fire and silence had created a new kind of family, not by blood or societal decree, but by a deeper, more enduring covenant of mutual respect and shared survival. Ilara thought of the auction block, of the humiliation and the dehumanization, the irony of finding true humanity and dignity in the heart of the wilderness, with a man deemed a savage, was a truth that resonated deeply within her. It was a testament to the fact that kindness, empathy, and strength could emerge from the most unexpected places, defying the narrow confines of societal judgment. They were no longer defined by their pasts, but by the choices they made each day, by the quiet acts of care and protection, by the simple, profound act of walking forward, together. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the prairie, but their faces were turned towards the light. The dramatic tension of their initial meeting had resolved into a quiet, hopeful resolution, a poignant testament to the power of human connection against overwhelming odds. The landscape, once a symbol of vast indifference, now mirrored the endless possibilities of their future, a future built not on promises, but on the unyielding strength of two souls finding shared ground in a world bent on tearing them apart. They were moving, not to a specific destination, but towards a life of their own making, a quiet defiance whispered on the endless wind.